Thank you. Thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here in St. John's. First time being here, and quite enjoy the city and learning more about Newfoundland and learning about the sort of the setting here, especially in the immigration context. So, in my role, I'm a current role project manager for a large project covering all of Northern Ontario. But previously, I've worked in employment counseling for over 15 years. I'm involved in career development on the national stage and so on. So I'm coming from this from a couple of different angles, if you will, or from a couple of different backgrounds in terms of the experiences. There we go. So it's been mentioned before, what is small, what is rural, what is remote? Jerry mentioned that. It's been mentioned a couple of times in discussions. And really what I like to say, it really is relative in a lot of ways. When we look at Northern Ontario compared to Southern Ontario, we have Sudbury, which is a CMA of over 160,000 people. And I was reminded when I went to PEI to do a presentation that that's pretty well the population of the entire province. So, as I said, it's relative. But if we compare Sudbury to, say, the GTA, we're very small. We're seen as very northern. We're seen as the other end of the earth by many people within the GTA area. So it's very relative. We only have two central metropolitan areas in Northern Ontario, only two, and they're 16 hours apart by car. And then when we look at the other communities, we have about 75,000, 64,000, and 43,000. And those make up our 5 major centers in Northern Ontario. So again, size is relative, and really what would be considered rural to some or remote to some wouldn't be to others. So I just wanted to just quickly touch on that. Many of ours are fly-in, fly-out communities in the mining communities. There's no road in, there's no road out. You have to fly in to get there. And just to highlight, again, perceptions and perspectives. So I found this when I was looking through, and I bet you if you went to Timmins and asked the people in Timmins, and you asked them, are you a remote community? Many would say no. You know, we have a direct flight to the downtown airport in Toronto. An hour and 20 minutes, roughly, you can be in downtown Toronto from Timmins. Is that remote? So again, perspective is very important, and I think it's important to highlight that when we have discussions around attraction integration into smaller rural and remote communities. Now, how do we compare to the larger urban areas in Ontario? And I think this is pretty true across the country in terms of urban versus rural, the MTVs, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. And there has been some discussion about pushing immigration out to the other areas of the country. But when we look in terms of the Ontario context, northeastern, northwestern Ontario, we are a small fraction of the overall population. And when we look in towards going forward, it even it grows disproportionately, even grows even more. So it's something that when we look at that, and it was mentioned earlier about who do we want to stay. I think Harold mentioned that. When we look at young professionals, very mobile, we'll go to the centers of activity, and they'll go to where the action is. Well, it's happening not in Northern Ontario. If we look in terms of the population growth is in Southern Ontario. Now, we still have opportunities. We have wonderful opportunities for growth. We have wonderful opportunities for a young professional to be able to get their foot in the door and be able to start their career. However, again, perception and of where the where that activity is occurring often is skewed towards Southern Ontario centers. So when we're looking at talent and where they go, working and promoting and promoting our areas, it becomes difficult. There's a lack of a critical mass in terms of ethnic communities sometimes, and that makes it difficult in terms of attraction and retention as well, because again of where the movement is going. So I think it's very important to mention that before who will stay. I think that's a very important piece of that. And then when we're promoting, or when regions are promoting, it's important to keep that in mind in terms of that. So I wanted to start with that because what I wanted to sort of talk about was some policy implications that sort of flow from that in terms of the large urban centers and the distortion in terms of of the population makeup and so on. So when we look at that, some of the decisions that can be impractical are centralized government services, for example. When we look at some of the situations or realities in Northern Ontario, to access some of the services, it may be that they're only offered in Toronto or in Ottawa or in Southern Ontario because of critical mass, possibly for funding decisions, funding formulas. When we look at something such as ESL or English as a Second Language, we continually fight to keep what we have there. When we look at the number of people that are in the number of bodies that are in the classrooms, we have quite often blended levels in terms of people in the class. And so what happens is that then we have, for example, an organization in Toronto promoting online study or correspondence study to ESL learners in Northern Ontario. It draws away from the in-class component or the ability for service providers to keep those people in class if there's another alternative being promoted out of Toronto to draw those people away from there. Online support, apply online, read it online, go to the website, go to the website, go to the website. Well, if you have poor connectivity, if we have a lot of areas in Northern Ontario that are dead zones in terms of mobile technology once you go to the larger urban centers, if you have those situations, then it becomes very difficult, very challenging to complete or be able to do those things online. So the push for that, we've seen immigration offices close across many parts of the country. Many of those areas are in northern rural remote areas. And now, so accessing a front door service is much more difficult. So if you are having difficulty with the online applications, if you're having difficulty with accessing websites and so on, it's very difficult to be able to get a front door service to that. So there are other things that relate to that too in terms of policy decisions. So there are other examples where for language testing, mandatory language testing, and having to the one situation where it was a decision whether you drive in a snowstorm for 4 or 5 hours to be able to take your language test, or if you can't do that, then you miss the language test. You have to wait. You have to wait 6 more months to be able to schedule it again. What decision do you make, because that impacts your immigration procedure application, and so on. So there are many examples like that where it becomes very impractical. Now, it's something where there may be, again, the critical mass becomes an issue, and it's something where there's always a fight to maintain programming because of numbers, because of comparisons of caseloads, workloads, when it's looked at from a very centralized source, or if it's looked at in a very cookie-cutter comparison with what else is being provided in the larger urban areas. IT infrastructure. So it's great when it works, and I'm happy to hear that there are many things that are happening. We have embraced using the technology as well, but it is limited at times. And so there are many areas too, as I mentioned before, that have difficulty with connectivity, with being able to have reliable connectivity. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not. It might be depending on which way the wind is blowing, and how you hold your phone is how you get connected. So there are many cases like that. So just to give more of a concrete example, so 30,000 customers in Northern Ontario and a territory spanning 200,000 square kilometers. So again, a business case. Where's the business case for private sector, for private business to go and put in the infrastructure for that? There really isn't, if you look at it from a business case perspective. So if it's not there, then how is somebody supposed to access it? So, or be able to connect to it. So in terms of the large urban centers, fiber op is there, very good connectivity is there, the resources are there. It's more when we spread out into the other areas in more northern rural. Once we get away from the highway corridor, you go 5 kilometers off the highway and you don't have any anymore. So it's more so in those smaller areas. And then keeping pace with the technology as well. So those are some of the, I just wanted to quickly mention there. Transportation challenges, and that's been mentioned quite a bit before, and it's very common, especially in northern rural remote areas. Again, if you have a low ridership, then how do you provide the service? So it's something that is problematic. If we're looking at where the funding comes to provide that service, municipal transit, we're looking at budgets and so on with the municipalities, and it's difficult to provide coverage or ample coverage for areas that are widely spread out. If we look at the city of Greater Sudbury, it's this area, the municipal boundaries, the municipal area is 3,400 square kilometers. 3,400 square kilometers. That's the city boundary. So as a municipality, you have responsibilities within those boundaries. How do you be able to provide service to that? And to give a concrete example in terms of a refugee family that arrived in Sudbury, housing was provided, very nice housing, ample housing. The bus service, terrible, absolutely terrible. And so it's something that the family, in all reality, probably will need to move because it's not conducive to schooling. It's for the children. It's not conducive to employment. It's not conducive to many of those other needs. So the bus maybe comes once every 2 hours during the week. It's a 45 to an hour-minute ride into the city. So how do you function if you rely on public transit for everything when that's the situation? So it is very challenging. Intercity is very challenging. Another concrete example is another family that is a 45-minute drive down the Trans-Canada Highway, major highway, and it's close to the major urban center, but the intercity transit is terrible. I think maybe one bus a day. So if they have to go in for appointments, if they have to do anything like that, it becomes a multi-day trip. Then where do they stay? The cost. So there are some very big challenges there in terms of that. But then if we look at the business side of it, the ridership is very low. So there's a large area to cover, and those areas as well. The intercity is one that's very challenged. We've seen a lot of reductions in major bus routes between intercities within Northern Ontario. We've seen other reductions in other areas as well. The train, if I get asked one more time to take the train to Ottawa, I will scream. I don't know if the person's here from Ottawa, but there's no train that goes to Ottawa from Sudbury. There isn't. There isn't, but it's so common because it's very comfortable, it's very economical to go Toronto to Ottawa, Toronto to Montreal. It's not possible. I can go catch a train. I have to go 45 minutes outside of the city to the train station, or I go 20 minutes into an industrial wasteland and it comes at 2 o'clock in the morning. I think 2 times a week or 3 times a week. It's just not feasible. So the lack of the transportation in terms of public transportation, what's available, is a very big challenge. Building a community. So some of the things in terms of looking at, I think, some solutions that work very, very well in terms of building communities is starting from the ground up. And in many areas in Northern Ontario, and I think that's true in many other parts of the country, in northern rural areas, is when we look at the population, Sudbury, for example, is 1% primary immigration, less than 2% visible minority population. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done from the ground up. There's a lot of work that needs to be done from a community level in order to be able to gain and build that support. So when we look at that, this is just one example. I know Michelle's here, and there's some other people from Northern Ontario. So I like to try and highlight some of the good work that's done there, and there's some wonderful work. And as well, smaller communities, I think, have an advantage where community can be built, and inclusion and feeling that sense of belonging to the community as a whole, I think, can be established much more deeply. So this is an example of one of the things in terms of Diversity Thunder Bay, which has done some excellent work. But again, it's building it from the ground up. Anti-oppression, anti-racism training, learning opportunities, awareness is very important. Again, when we look at the demographic makeup of the population, there's work that needs to be done there to create that understanding within the population. The one thing that was mentioned earlier that I just took a quick note on was building, when we were talking about promoting the story of immigration within the community. I think you have to be very careful, because if we look at, say, Sudbury, for example, there were waves of immigration up until about the 1960s. And then it really, really petered off because there was opportunity with the mines. Where did those waves of immigration come from? A lot of them were from Italy, Finland, European countries. Where are the waves of immigration coming now? Much, much different composition. So if we go back and we look at that narrative, and built upon immigration, or we are a city or an area of immigrants. Well, how many in the 1950s and 60s came from Pakistan, for example, during that time? So again, I just wanted to quickly comment on that, because I've heard it as sort of a running story many times, but I think if you dig down deeper, I think there needs to be further discussion on what that really is. Because I've heard it often where, we're a city of immigrants. Well, yes, but when? When did that happen? When did that stop? And who were the people that were coming? Are they the same people that are coming now? And making that realization, I think, is very important. Leadership from municipal and officials and others is key, absolutely key. And I was talking earlier with some other people about this. Especially when you're looking in communities that this might be fairly new to, or communities that have a certain way of doing things that they've done for the last 50 years. So the one example, again, to highlight within the region, Timmins, Ontario is a mining community, as I mentioned. It's 8 hours north of Toronto. There are many perceptions about that, a rough and tumble type of community. But the mayor there has made it a point, excellent, thank you, has made it a point of making it a welcoming community and doing the necessary work to try and change maybe perceptions within the wider community of that. So again, this is from the Timmins Press. I put this in terms of source there, but it's from the applause to those who promote racial harmony in the community. So the mayor is backing it. The mayor is fully behind it, and then so you have the city behind it. You need the civic leadership is key. In Sudbury, we have the Greater Sudbury Police Service International Ride-Along Program. Excellent program with the police services and the international community, mostly international students, to make that bridge. So it's the municipal leaders, the civic leaders, it's the leaders of authority that need to be part of that as well in terms of building an inclusive community. And then leveraging post-secondary institutions, I think that's something that's often overlooked. I think there's a lot of opportunity when we're talking about changing perspectives, changing attitudes, changing experiences, exposure. Post-secondary institutions can play a vital role in terms of tapping into research funding, tapping into tools, resources, in terms of getting the message out there. I think of NOSM, Northern Ontario School of Medicine, in terms of how they've been able to do their learning models and spread it all across Northern Ontario, the fly-in, fly-outs everywhere. So that's a very important part as well. So, excuse me, so the civic leadership is essential. Building the community from the ground up is essential in terms of creating those opportunities for awareness, discussion, dialogue, and then leveraging the post-secondary institutions. And I think I'm pretty well out of time there. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.